Good evening, everybody. Our guest this evening is a man who knows as much as anyone on the practice and the theory of modern warfare as it's currently being fought by the British Army. Last year he commanded the three-para battle group in its deployment in Helmand Province in Afghanistan, and in the 6 months that followed that deployment his men saw the most concentrated and sustained fighting that I think the British Army has seen in living memory. In my book, Three Para, I described him as a soldier scholar who has as many degrees as battle honours. As well as a great deal of operational experience, he's an expert in counterinsurgency, an expertise which was tested to the full in Afghanistan. I also described him as slight, wiry and intense. He prevailed upon me to remove the intense bit, saying that in military speak, this is a code word for humorless bastard. Having known him for a year or more, I can tell you that this is absolutely not the case. He emerged from the war with a DSO to go with his other distinctions. He's now a full colonel and has recently been appointed Chief of Staff of the newly created 6th Division. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome Stuart Tootal. So the way I think we should do this is I'm going to start off with a few questions. I know a lot of you will have your own questions. So after a decent interval, I'll ask you to come in, just raise your hands. The microphone will be brought to you and away we'll go. Stuart, I'm going to start off just by asking you about, at the beginning, you come to this war it's not a war at this stage, you come to this operation with a great deal of knowledge about the theory and from Iraq, the practice of counterinsurgency operations. You're there actually to create a security zone. There's not meant to be any fighting necessarily. At first sight, when you arrived in Helmand, did you think this was a feasible project to establish a security zone where reconstruction, or as we now say, more accurately, construction, could take place?
I think when we arrived, we considered it was a worthy endeavour to try and create pockets of security in which we would then introduce reconstruction and development to sort of bring about stabilising Afghan society, and particularly amongst Pashtuns in Helmand Province. And I think it was a worthy effort, and I think it was something that was worth trying to do. However, my concern was, I mean, reading one's history about Afghanistan, and also when I visited Afghanistan before we deployed there, I'd spent some time with an American task force in Zabul province. And it was interesting to note the level of fighting they're engaged with. I thought that if we got away with doing no more than securing areas and not really engaging in fighting in the Taliban, that we'd be incredibly unfortunate. So when we suddenly arrived, and it was relatively benign for the first 6 weeks, and I think there was a certain amount of the Taliban looking at us and probably us looking at them to some extent. And then it went live with a vengeance, probably from about the 4th of June. And we weren't really surprised by that. I think we were surprised by the level of intensity. The operation had been billed as what the military calls a peace support operation, as I've described, going in, creating a security environment, bringing in development. And then it turned to a sort of full-blown counterinsurgency with a definite sort of war-fighting phase. So I think mentally my soldiers knew it might be coming. So I don't think it took us by surprise. I think it was just the pure intensity of doing it day in, day out, where virtually every single member of the battle group, which was more than just 3 para, our supporting arms, artillery engineers, etc., were fully engaged in fighting. So not a surprise in terms of we did some fighting, but the fact that it just went on at such intensity throughout the rest of the tour.
So this was an intelligence failure to a degree, wasn't it? Not understanding the commitment and the resources and indeed the strategy of the Taliban. In retrospect, would you say that?
I think it's harsh to describe it as an intelligence failure. The intelligence was not mature, but then if you compare it to other counterinsurgency campaigns we've been involved in, like Northern Ireland, to get where we got to even 10 years ago was 20 years of development of intelligence, gaining contacts, gaining familiarity. We were the first people in. So the intelligence picture was quite sketchy. No one had really operated in Helmand Province before. There had been a small number of Americans who were part of a PRT, a province reconstruction team, who were driving round trying to deliver aid and benefit, and there are only about 100 of those. What is also interesting about Helmand Province, because we did put some advanced reconnaissance forces in there, and we found this in our own experience, you can drive into an Afghan village once, and you may sit down, you may drink tea, it may be very benign. You do it a second or third time, and you may suddenly find yourself with a fight on your hands, because the Afghans are very good at counting your guns before they engage you. So I think a lot of the reconnaissance effort we put in came away with a false perception of what Helmand Province was like, because they were just going in once or twice and didn't have a time to establish a pattern. But once we'd begun to establish patterns of behaviour, that's when the Taliban had basically done their own intelligence analysis of us and then started to engage us.
So do you think now, with your experience and the experience of the people that have followed you, we now have a fairly good intelligence picture? And if that's the case, how do you see the Taliban? Where are they going? And who are they now?
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of the intelligence picture is much, much better. And I was in Afghanistan about 3 weeks ago. And what was very clear is probably about 90% of the actionable intelligence, i.e. information that is then turned into some sort of a military, and it's not just military effect, but economic, socio-political development, is coming from the people. Yes, of course, there are other ways of gathering intelligence, but it's a lot of Afghan people, particularly, and probably people have heard about Sangin and the Sangin Valley, that now people are talking to the coalition. There's a greater sense of confidence amongst the soldiers. And I was shown a slide which showed two pictures, and it showed Sangin probably shortly after we left it, towards the end of the Royal Marines tour. The bazaar was empty, lots of damage from fighting, and was a battle zone. I then saw another slide which was taken about a month ago. The bazaar's open, full of pots and pans. There's a lot of commerce going on. They're now building some schools up there. They're developing the roads. All the things you need to do to win over the people, because that is the only way that the campaign will be won for the benefit of the Afghan people. And what that means is that because there are now more forces in Afghanistan, certainly in Sangin has been secured in a way that has managed to push the fighting out, give the people a level of security where they feel confident that they're protected from the Taliban. Consequently, they're seeing aid and development flowing in, and they're gaining confidence that actually the coalition forces there, heavily supported by the Afghan forces, is the right way to develop, and it's beginning to give them investment, particularly, admittedly, small ink spots, as per counterinsurgency sort of theory, but it's delivering a level of investment after 30 years of everything the Afghans have gone through that is a bright spot on the horizon, and the people are responding to that, because in effect, in simplistic terms, the hearts and minds, certainly of those people in Sangin, is slowly being won over. So that sort of then answers the second part, that if we can create further ink spots, increase the level of security, except there's some probably hard fighting to do on the way, then we will win over more and more of the people. The more that happens, and the path is not certain, but I think there is a positive development, we're going in the right way, the more we begin to separate the people from the insurgents themselves. Again, classic counterinsurgency. Once that happens, the support for the Taliban begins to dry up, because they are being discredited by the fact that they have not been able to push the coalition out, and more importantly, as the Afghans become more capable of their own security arrangements in terms of development of the Afghan army, it will increasingly push the Taliban out. The Taliban cannot survive to any positive effect in their own terms as an insurgent force if they don't have the support of the people. And I think that support is now being significantly eroded. Still a long way to go, and there are still some very complex issues to deal with. And we're already seeing now that the Taliban are being pushed into a more what we call asymmetric stance, where rather than taking us on in classic guerrilla-style tactics, some of which is still going on, they're increasingly turning towards suicide bombers, IEDs, perhaps relying on more external fighters from across the border, all of which in the longer term, if they're trying to retain the support of the people, are actually quite counterproductive to what they're trying to achieve.
You mentioned the Afghan security forces, and they're obviously absolutely vital to any long-term solution. The picture that emerges from your stay in Helmand Province, your tour there, And the picture that one gets from Helmand now is that despite the intensive training efforts, despite the kind of political will in Kabul, there seems to be a huge gap in the security picture which should be filled by the Afghan police and the Afghan army. What seems to be happening, and it has happened over the last year, is that the coalition forces go in, take an area, hand over to the Afghans, withdraw, the Afghans promptly lose it back to the Taliban again. This clearly is a problem, and how would you deal, how can we possibly deal with that?
Well, I think you developed that view, which is not an entirely incorrect view, from what happened in Musakala last year, where we had some forces in. The elders were then keen to stop the fighting between ourselves and the Taliban, and we came up with a local arrangement where they would look after their own security arrangements, keep the Taliban out, and then we withdrew. And then a few months after that, the Taliban came in, pushed the elders out, and effectively retook the town. You're absolutely right. You do need to put Afghan forces in place, and part of the UK's approach and general NATO's approach is you've got to have an Afghan face. So every operation we did with Afghan soldiers. Pretty immature when we got there, fairly recently trained, certainly a lot of issues, but they were a bright spot on the horizon, and certainly going back a few weeks ago, I've noticed there are now more ANA, Afghan National Army soldiers. They're much better. They've still got some way to go. There are some real cultural issues we need to deal with, and for example, we cook on hexamine cooking blocks. They will not cook on them. They only cook on wood to boil their rice and all the rest of it. And if you give them hexamine, they'll stop fighting. And it's a sort of small thing to sort of learn and to acknowledge. But we're becoming much better at managing the cultural nuances of the way they do business. And if you get that right, actually they're pretty brave, and they'll fight all day. They're relatively well paid. They're reasonably equipped. They could be better equipped, but people have got that. People are trying to make that difference. So I think the ANA are beginning to make a difference. They're not tribally based. That's important as well. The ANP are probably presenting far more of a challenge. The trouble with the ANP is, one, these are local constables, so they come from the tribal areas. They're not well paid. They're not trained. They're pretty ill-disciplined. It's not to say there aren't some good ones there as well, but in many senses the ANP are more unpopular than the Taliban, just because the way they do business, because they're not a well-trained, constructed force, and Afghans fundamentally have a lack of faith in civic institutions, not least because of their history in the last 30 years. So we have to address that. And again, when I was out in the province, I saw significant efforts. We always knew the ANP were a real problem unless we addressed it. But now what are called PMTs, police mentoring teams, have been set up with interpreters, with military police, and it's beginning to make a difference. And there are now ANP who are still local, but they're mentored and they're partnered by military policemen. That's happening across the region, so it's not just Helmand, it's also happening in places like Zabul, Oruzgan and Kandahar. So it's beginning to make a difference, but there's a long, long way to go, and definitely addressing the Afghan National Police issue is really important.
I'd like to ask a more general question about the British Army. A little while ago, John Lorimer, the brigade commander in Helmand, said that he imagined that British people should prepare themselves for the idea that the British Army is going to be involved in Afghanistan one way or another for as long as it has been involved in Northern Ireland. So we're talking about getting on for 40 years. Do you share that view? And if you do, how do you think morale can be sustained? Because Afghanistan is a very different place from Northern Ireland. I think most of us would accept that it creates much greater strains on family life, on the basic sort of social fabric of the army.
Well, I think he's right. Any counterinsurgency is a protracted affair, and you only have to look at any other campaigns we've been involved in, whether it's the Dhofar or Malaya. I mean, they've taken a decade at least, if not more. So I definitely think we need to prepare ourselves to be in the long haul. And I think people are signing up to that. Ambassadors said that in the last few months. How does that impact on the army? Well, it probably impacts on us in a number of ways. I mean, first of all, the British Army is designed, raised and trained to go on operations. That's what people want to do. It's what my soldiers definitely want to do. I mean, that's the business we're in. My battalion is highly likely, although officially it's not being announced, is likely to go back to Afghanistan in the near future. And there is a perceptible enthusiasm amongst my soldiers to go back to Afghanistan. And they want to get involved. You know, they understand the balance, that it's not just about fighting, it is about winning the people over. But you know, they're paratroopers, they're trained to do that. I don't think they're particularly unique. I think that spreads across the rest of the British Army. So doing this in the longer term is not a problem from the moral component of what people want to do and our raison d'etre. The problem you have is how do you sustain that when people are taking risk on a continued basis, and how do you make sure all the resources are in place? And I think what the Army is having to wrestle with at the moment is transitioning from an army essentially designed for a peacetime environment with Northern Ireland, etc., to a more war-fighting establishment and approach to operations. And I think conceptually, mentally, from a point of view of morale and attitudes, we're absolutely there. What we've now got to do is bring on the resources to sustain that. And that's recognised by the MOD, so improved housing, improved medical care, and all those sort of things that underpin, if you're going to keep throwing people back into the combat zone, and this isn't lost on the MOD, so I'm not saying anything that's groundbreaking, but you've then got to make sure you've got the commensurate support services to keep on sustaining that. And that's why CGS has made such an effort and importance of improving the medical services, as one example.
An American friend of mine said to me the other day that he was amazed at the lack of public awareness in Britain of what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he made the comparison with America, where the activities of the American military are not only front-page news, head the TV bulletins, but also a matter of enormous political debate. And he found that people were A, fairly ignorant about what's happening in Afghanistan, and B, not terribly interested. Has that been your experience?
I have a sort of mixed view, because you know, lots of people have turned up. I mean, when I've spoken to my friends and their friends, they're all massively interested in what we're doing and what we went through, and that's quite heartening. And the support we've received from a lot of people in our community has been awesome, actually. But at the same time, I think you're right. I mean, when I travel in the States, occasionally working, I've been in uniform, and I've walked into Denny's to maybe have breakfast with some other people, and I've gone to pay the bill. And, you know, that's taken care of, sir. You look around, you say, sorry, and they say, well, you know, you're supporting the cause, etc., and actually the proprietor has paid for you. And you haven't even spoken to the guy, and you say thank you, and you walk out, and you think, well, I wouldn't imagine that happening regularly in the United Kingdom. And it's an interesting thing, and I sometimes wonder whether our public information campaign is quite as good as it is, because when you then meet people who may not be particularly educated on the military or geopolitical situations and all the rest of it, you walk into your average pub here, you would find there are a lot of what I'd call middle ground people who turn around and would be quite inspired by what you're doing. And some of the debates have been going on about charitable support and all the rest of it. So actually, I think the British public is a very fertile community. But the trouble is they need to be aware of it, and I don't know how we sometimes improve that. And yes, there have been minor exceptions. One or two of my soldiers got berated when they're in Selly Oak by people who felt they shouldn't be there. But that really is the exception. I mean, the general perception when people come across us, or we hear them, or people write to us, has been fantastic and really important. It's very important for the soldiers to know that they have a grateful nation. Could we be more grateful? Yes, I certainly think we could do.
Which brings me on to a question which will interest, I think, a lot of people, most of the people who are probably connected to the media. You had the odd experience of having your tour very underreported. The sequence of events was that Christina Lamb from the Sunday Times got caught up in a firefight with your guys. She wrote an extremely graphic, very brilliant, I think, report on the occasion. That seems to have created havoc in number 10, and the word seems to have gone out, as I understand it, you know, no more of this kind of reporting for Afghanistan, because it doesn't get across the story that we want told, and so there was more or less a news blackout for, and I think up until September of last year. Did that, do you think that in any way affected what you were doing? Did people feel that they were undervalued, or what they were doing wasn't being recognised?
Well, we asked, and I don't know if anyone saw some of Bill Neely and Eugene Campbell's footage. Well, they came because we asked for them, because we felt that there was so much going on, it needed to be captured. And I can remember going up to Sangin, I can't remember the journalist's name, worked for ITN as well. He came up to me during one operation, and this is with the time where the press felt very frustrated they weren't getting through. There were lots of stories coming out about Sangin, some rather flawed historical analogies with Rorke's Drift, etc. And he came up to me during this operation. I was smoking a fag, talking to my RSM, and he said, do you mind if I talk to you about two things? And I thought, oh shit, here we go. And he said, well, first of all, I'd like to say you're clearly in control of Sangin. I mean, he saw us when we had lots of forces there, and we definitely, the Taliban had sort of disappeared on that particular day when we sort of turned up after a little bit of fighting. And he said, secondly, the morale of your soldiers is sky high. And that sort of provoked me to think, well, this is a really positive message. Because for every one story, and, you know, you will have the odd whinger who will turn around and say, well, we didn't get resupplied today, and that will be taken out of context, and someone may want to make something of it in the press. But I could line up another 30 soldiers without prompting who would turn around and say, look, not being resupplied for one day because we were going to potentially lose a helicopter being shot down. So the commanding officer made the decision that we would allow stores to run out. Well, we weren't going to starve. We could drink river water. We're paratroopers. We're a force raised to operate behind enemy lines, 1940, etc., etc. You get blokes who just turn around and say, yeah, it's shit to be hungry for a day, but it's part of the business we're in, and we're not really worried about that. Now, listen to all the other good things we're doing. And I think we missed a trick, and I'd like to think we restored the balance a little bit by getting Bill and Eugene in, who patiently waited for, I think, 2.5 weeks to go into Sangin. I mean, we couldn't have scripted it better for them, because literally as they arrived, they went into an HLS, which we deliberately offset, so we put it further back from where we normally fly in to try and make it a bit safer. Not just because of them, but partly because we didn't want to lose 2 ITN journalists. And they got shot up on the landing zone, the DZ, whatever you want to call it, and loved it to a certain extent. But they got some really good copy from it, and you know, people were seeing this stuff and going, this is awesome, this is amazing, look at what our soldiers are doing. Now, yes, I'm sure some people say, well, why are we there, etc. But actually the general feeling was a sense of, actually, we've got a bloody good army, and it's going out and it's doing some quite phenomenal things. And I think we missed a trick to really exploit that. And Christina in the audience, I mean, when we read that article, I didn't read it and think, oh, God, this is going to drop us in the shit. I thought, actually, for any average Joe public reading this, he can but not fail to be impressed. You know, 1 or 2 of the people in C Company that Christina was with got a bit of a slagging for some of the things they said, and they did, and all the rest of it, and sort of friendly banter and paid quite a lot of port and champagne. But at the same time, it was good, positive stuff. So we were quite surprised at the reaction, you know, and that's not to say there's not the odd story written by someone which we don't really like and we think is imbalanced or unbalanced or whatever. But we generally thought, no, this is good stuff because it's saying what we're doing. So in a long-winded way, what I've said is, yeah, I think we got it wrong, but I think we tried to address it. And the relationship the military has with the press, I think, is very important. And generally I found that none of the reporters we had who were from different organisations, possibly with different agendas, certainly different characters, never really caused us a problem, because I'd turn around and say that you actually have complete access to what I do. And I can remember a media handler stopping. I was having a brew and I'd met some journalists and I said, well, come into my ops room and I'll just sort of talk you through stuff. And one of the media military handlers had then stopped these journalists and said, you can't go in there, it's a top secret location. For fuck's sake, you know, it's my headquarters, don't tell them where they can't go. And I know, because of the conversation we've had, I said, please do not take any information from screens, and please do not bother my staff, you know, because they've got work to do, but this is the best place for me to brief you. And of course they would completely respect that, and they didn't have a problem. And when I was allowed to manage more the media myself, not myself, but with my staff, and I said, look, you know, always make them feel welcome, always be transparent, be as honest as you can, but at the same time be quite clear of a balanced approach, lines to take, not to cross lines of security, etc. And by treating the journalists like that, they responded, I think, very positively and very favourably. And actually, the closer you get a journalist to you, the more sort of the Stockholm syndrome you develop. No doubt lots of people would disagree with that. But I think there is something from that. And I can always remember learning from, I was a platoon commander and in Northern Ireland, and it was when people still shot at you. And the Guardian were coming to do virtually a troops out thing. And we had a very bold, punchy commanding officer who said, right, send them down to Delta Company, put them in the jocks, and take them down RPG Alley. And, you know, on cue, fire a couple of RPGs and all the rest of it. And these quite initially unpleasant journalists who were here to do a sort of troops out story from The Guardian, in the back of the wagons when they were wearing their body armour and the RPGs were coming and my soldiers were looking after them and making sure they weren't hurt, came back and wrote a thoroughly positive story which was all focused on the tenacity of, you know, Scottish soldiers and all the rest of it. And it was that sort of, there's a lesson from that, that actually perhaps we need to be less risk averse in some respects, because I think we get more out of the media. But to be fair, I'm here talking to you, it's sanctioned by the MOD, so I think that's an indication of that, you know, we are learning and we are getting better at it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in this game for 25 years, and I've heard this sort of every 6 months since the Falklands, I think, so I won't be holding my breath about that, but it's good to hear anyway. Okay, well, I've had my say, so I think now we should open up the floor to questions. Fire away. This gentleman in the front here.
Hi. Sorry to ask you a possibly basic question, but is there a definite exit strategy for Afghanistan?
Yes, I think quite simply, once Afghanistan has been stalled to a level of stability where they are no longer representing a threat to the international community and this country, then I think we would disengage, and there'd be a progressive line, one hopes, and you can't put a timeline on it. It's probably 15, 20 years away, possibly more, might be sooner, of what you're trying to do is hand over more and more responsibility to the Afghans themselves, because it's their country and they should run it.
Is that measurable?
No, I don't think it is, but it's not a science. None of these things are. Plans change. I mean, you know, it's a military maxim of no plan stands first major encounter with the enemy, no plan stands contact. So I don't think that the fact that no politician or military officer can say, here is a timeline, here is the exact plan, shouldn't surprise anyone, because it's not the nature of what fighting a counterinsurgency campaign is like. I'm not to say it's not very important, particularly to a public who are supporting their forces abroad, so I'm not dismissing it, but the honest answer is you can't put a timeline on it. You can have a fairly clear direction you'd wish to go, but your ability to follow that will be very much based on circumstance and events.
This gentleman here in the front, one row back. There.
Sorry, just two questions. At the very beginning you said it wasn't an intelligence failure in any way. What account is taken of the Soviet experience? That's my first question. What reading was taken from that? The second is, could the army continue its success against the Taliban without the unopposed air power that it has now?
I mean, the first answer is we, interestingly enough, had a Russian, a couple of Russians who came down who'd fought in Afghanistan. They talked a lot about how much vodka they drank and how many losses they took as well, which was quite sobering. And we also got some experts who understood Afghanistan, and we're talking about people at the press. Christina Lamb came down at our invitation, Jason Burke came down, and a number of academics talked to us as well. So I think we tried to learn as much as we could about the environment, and that's partly why we endured, because as I was saying to Patrick, we weren't completely surprised by what happened. Was it an intelligence failure? I don't think it was intelligence failure. I think it was there was a misappreciation, and I think the misappreciation was that you need to go and visit an area several times before you get a real feel about it. And of course, a lot of the information fed to us, as I said, was because they were one-off trips. So I think we drew heavily on the Afghan experience. And there was a document called written by the Frunze Academy, which is one of their sort of military think tanks and educational centres, and we drew heavily on their vignettes. And a lot of my training my soldiers went through was based through some of the lessons that, for example, 14th Corps, which was their own paracorps, went through, particularly in the Penchvar Valley in the mid-70s. So hopefully that answers your first question. The air power bit, if we didn't have unopposed air power, we would take more casualties. But would I be prepared to match my soldiers on completely equal terms with the Taliban? Yes, and we would win. I'd probably take more casualties, but we would roll them. I'm quite convinced about that. And that's not because I'm dismissive about the Taliban's capabilities as adversaries either.
This man here at the end of the row there.
Again, two brief questions, and I've just finished your book actually, which I enjoyed very, very much. Recommend everyone. It's the depiction of the Afghan National Police in the book. They do seem to come off as a sort of dope-smoking pederasts who really don't want to do much work most of the time, and that presumably partly reflects a different notion of what policing is, a tradition of policing which is a million miles away from our own. And I'm curious to find out how, even with mentoring, one can turn around a policing culture where people think you become a policeman, so you can hang around all day and extort bribes from people, to turn that into something more concrete. But my second question is about air support, and about someone told me that when you were out there, one of the problems was when you were being resupplied, without enough helicopters, when Chinooks would come in, they didn't have enough helicopters. So on the second and third landing, they would definitely take fire from Taliban. And presumably that means we need more helicopters.
Yeah, Johnny, I think it's probably me talking to you, telling you about the second and the third wave. Yeah, without a shadow of doubt, we need more helicopters. And it's something that we need to address. It's something that the MOD is trying to address. I've got my MOD lines here, and it tells me that. But it is. I mean, I definitely see, but we have definitely got a shortage of helicopters, and it's something we need to address. And I would be dishonest if I said anything else. And it was a real issue that I had, trying to make fairly tight rotary wing assets stretch. We managed to make it work. Good practices, brilliant pilots in the Air Force. I mean, fantastic. But yeah, we need more helicopters, without a shadow of a doubt.
Can I just jump in? Is that being addressed? I mean, there's this famous mothballed half-dozen Chinooks. Are they being unmothballed
People
now?
are trying to work really hard to do that. I mean, I can't talk about that in detail because I'm not party to all the information, but I'm confident that people are trying to make a real effort to make a difference to that at the end of the day. I mean, it's a problem that's recognised. So people aren't saying, oh, no, you know, we're ignoring that problem. That it is fully recognised, and people are trying to do what they can. And I know for a fact that certain facilitators are providing helicopters. Being looked at many different ways that we might do it, how we bring more online. I haven't got all the details, and I'm in danger of straying into commercial confidences and all that sort of thing. But people are trying to address it, but it hasn't been addressed. But it is something we definitely need to address. We are short of helicopters, bottom line. The old police, I think it's about training, and I think actually a lot of it's got to do with money. They're not well paid. This is why some of the corruption exists. You know, why should they go out and take risk, taking on the Taliban, or bothering to get punched on the nose by Mrs. Wali because, you know, her chicken strayed on someone else's lap? Why go through all that hassle if you're not paid? You might as well sleep in your checkpoint and smoke dope and all the rest of it. I'll probably be doing exactly the same thing. So actually it's a lot about how we train these guys, but we then need to pay them. So they actually have a good job. Afghans are very proud, and I think if they think there's something worth doing, they're actually capable of doing it very well, but they've got to be resourced to do it. And they've got to be paid. The ANA, by comparison, are regularly paid. They are much better. They are far. I mean, the difference between the two is huge. So if you can do it with one force, well, I think there's certainly some more challenges with the police. I think it's entirely possible. And this is why we set up these mentoring teams, because it was something that was meant to have been done and addressed in a different way 18 months ago. That hasn't worked for whatever reasons. So at the local level, people are saying, right, let's throw soldiers, funny old thing, let's throw soldiers at it to make it work. and that's what they're doing. But it's pretty immature. It's a long way to go. But I think there is a solution to the police, but not overnight.
The lady here in the third row back.
Not to go on about the health, there's just something I wanted to run past you. I was at a press facility today because they were introducing the first of 6 new Merlins they've brought. They've sort of...
Yeah, I should have said that actually. It's probably in my pack somewhere.
No, but these Merlins are going to Iraq and they're sending refurbished Sea Kings to Afghanistan. Sea Kings are, as far as I know, I'm no helicopter expert, are very old, not really suited to the conditions. Okay, they have been refitted and stuff. It just seems a really strange decision.
Well, there are probably a number of reasons for that. First one is the majority of our Merlins are in Iraq, and Iraq is an operation that's running, and it needs helicopter support as well. So it makes sense to send the same type of aircraft there. And I'm slightly second guessing because,
no, that's right.
but I think that makes sense for that to have a single fleet in one location. Consequently, we're getting, Afghanistan's receiving the Sea Kings. They have been upgraded, they have been updated. They will improve our capacity to do certain things, particularly lifting casualties out and that sort of thing. Flown by Navy pilots who are very good because of what they do, landing on ships, moving up and down in choppy water and that sort of thing. It's very important, even in the desert. And so that's, I think, the reason for that. I mean, and it is also a reflection of scarce rotary wing resources, that Iraq has to take some of the resources, some have to go to Afghanistan. But you're right, it's not the best platform, it is old, it has been refurbished. Would it be nice to have a shiny, nice new fleet of Black Hawks? Yes, it would. But I'm not in the procurement industry. So I can only tell you as a ground commander, that's the sort of thing that I would like. And it is the sort of thing the MOD are looking at various options. It's an interim measure, but it is a demonstration. They recognise the problem, they're trying to do something about it.
The man on the end here.
Hi, my name is John D. McHugh. I'm a photographer. I've been in Afghanistan a few times recently. I'm not sure this will be covered in your pack, but last May when I was in Lashkar-Gah, I think before pretty much anyone else, when the MOD were still telling us that no one could get there, there was some tension obvious with the military people and DFID. I believe that broke down a lot more over the course of last year. I know there was a lot of talk with COIN or counterinsurgency and setting up this security zone. There was a lot of talk about quick impact projects. And as far as I know, they failed to materialise, or certainly when I was there and the people I kept in touch with afterwards, there seemed to be a big breakdown there. And then just to sort of tie in with that, at the moment with the controversy with Blackwater, DFID had their own PMC, they had their own private military company out there providing protection for them. What are your thoughts on that? How do you feel that works, and how does it reflect in the British Army?
Well, if I answer your first one first, I think DFID use Armour Group, who are a very good company, and I know that because they're mainly former paratroopers, many of whom I've commanded, and I met them in for a beer in Kabul, and I don't think they're cowboys. I'm not suggesting necessarily anyone else is, but I know for a fact that Armour Group aren't. There have certainly been no incidents of shooting Afghan civilians or the private security companies running amok or anything like that. So I don't think that's a big concern, actually, at the end of the day. Would I work with these guys? Yes, I would, and I did, partly because I know some of them, but they generally recruit like-minded people. They're a company. They know they can't afford to recruit people who would do inappropriate things.
Sorry, the point I was trying to make there is, I know guys who've gone to Armour Group as well, and obviously you're losing resources because they're going for the money. They're taking their experience which they've got in the army, and they're going to a private military company, and they're making a lot more money.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem. It's a marketplace. It's, supply and demand. There are private soldiers working for Armour Group who probably earn significantly more than I do. But do I want to go and work in a private security company guarding a compound or guarding a diplomat? Or would I rather be commanding my battalion, wearing my maroon beret and all the rest of it? I can tell you what I'd rather be doing at the end of the day. The outflow of soldiers has reduced because a lot of these guys who now serve with people like Armour Group and various other companies realise life isn't all about money. Do you want to necessarily go and sit in Iraq or Afghanistan and be on convoys day in, day out with all the threats associated to that, not necessarily with the same backup that you'd have if you were with 3 Para or 2 Royal Anglian or whoever it might be. So it's less of an issue than it was. I think it attracted a lot of people out because it was, you know, rock star wages and all the rest of it. But, you know, in the longer term, would I rather be a rock star or a paratrooper? I'd rather be a paratrooper. Ish, yes, I would. It's less of an issue, but I don't think the guys we worked with were a problem at all. I was quite happy to work with them because they spoke the same language, because we'd also served together anyway. Yeah, differed the whole comprehensive approach. I don't think this worked brilliantly to begin with. It was something that we'd never done before. It was absolutely right to have a comprehensive approach of bringing everyone in. But there wasn't experience, there wasn't familiarity. Having been in Afghanistan recently and spent quite a lot of time in Lashnagar talking to regional coordinators, I'm absolutely convinced any lessons have been learnt. It's significantly better. And I looked at a figure in my pack, actually, I can't remember what it is, but it's something like, and I'm Chatham House rules, so if I'm inaccurate, it doesn't really matter so much, but, you know, £170 million has been slated, 150 quick impact projects are running, the levers that people need, and it's, you know, the military, secondary and subordinate, it's all those things that actually win over the people on top of security. I think DFID's got that, I think the FCO's got that. There's a very capable regional coordinator now, and the whole thing has changed, and you could just sort of see it. People were talking the same language. That's not to say that there might be differences of opinion of how things are done, but that's natural in any organisation. So I think it's dramatically improved from the days when I struggled to get a washing machine fixed, which I could have done. Well, I couldn't have done it myself, but some of my people, well, Patrick talks about in his book, which apparently has really upset people. Hey, but that's tough, that's where it was. But we've moved on a long way since then. So, and you know, that's not in my pack. In fact, most of what I said isn't in my pack, so I'll probably get in trouble after this anyway. But no, I joke. But it is that's a positive message. It's changed. People have got it, and it's more than just the military. It's got to be across all lines of government development, economic, socio-political, etc. And it's beginning to happen. Maybe small steps, but they're positive ones.
There with the white shirt.
Hi. In your opinion, what would be the main impact on the region if we fail in Afghanistan, and more specifically on Pakistan?
Well, I think the first impact would be on this country. I mean, if you accept, which I do, that Afghanistan was the cradle of 9/11, to have a region like that that is so unstable, and it's so lawless. You can go into places like the Bagram Valley and the Sangin Valley, and unless you're dominating them with some form of security force, you can do what the hell you like, and no one will know what you're doing. So if you want to put plans together, run in attacks against this country or anywhere else in Europe, you're going to be able to do that. So we can't afford to let that happen, and I think that would be the first impact. That's why we're there. I mean, it's a clear-cut rationale at the end of the day, so that people can go about their daily business without getting blown up on tubes or in a skyscraper when they go to work. It sounds simplistic and it sounds a bit emotive, but actually it's true. The impact on on Pakistan, and I'm not an expert about Pakistan's sort of geopolitical situation, but of course what it would do is it would probably create some form of haven and for some form of expansion of the Waziristan influence of sort of Taliban and AQ to then start going further north. So it would give them more territory, probably more access to resources. So would it be destabilising on the current Pakistan regime? Yeah, I think it probably would be. Although they've got quite a lot of latitude anyway in the border areas.
Can we have one right from the back, because it's been a bit neglected, that lady on the next to the door. Yeah.
You mentioned the different attitudes towards soldiers when you went to America compared to in Britain. Do you think that's reflective of the attitudes on the ground in Afghanistan between the US and the British troops?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Well, the very positive attitude towards American soldiers when they're back at home.
Yeah.
Do you think that they have a different attitude towards the war that you're fighting to the British troops when they're on the ground?
Yes, I do. I think that they have a greater sense of cause than my blokes did. Happy with what we were doing, saw it as entirely legitimate, but they went to war with 3-para because it was 3-para and it was about their mates and it was about testing and proving themselves, which is why soldiers go to war. And I think that applies to the Americans as well. But the Americans have 9/11. 9/11 has impacted as some form of touchstone on the psyche of America. And I can remember meeting a Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel who'd spent something like 5 of the last 6 years deployed on operations either in Afghanistan or Iraq, or I think down in Panama. And I remember looking at him and saying, how the hell did you cope with that? And he just looked at me and fixed me with his eyes and said, "Sir, war isn't won yet." That was his answer. Now, your average Brit wouldn't answer you like that. You know, he'd say, because my wife and my dog left me, so I've got no choice but to carry on doing this. But there is a completely different approach in terms of mental attitude. I'm not necessarily saying their way is wrong, but then I'm not being critical of our own way, because my soldiers' passion and professionalism came just from something a little bit different. And it's a classic British way, isn't it? Of, you know, not trying to take yourself too seriously and all that sort of thing. But, I mean, you know, the American resources that they are putting to the war on terror, whether it's Iraq or it's Afghanistan, you probably need that some sort of national impetus, whatever you want to call it, to sustain that level of commitment. And they do it, and actually they do it very well. And in some ways I take my hat off to them. It's not to say there aren't ways in the American approach, perhaps, which many people might be critical of. Likewise, the Americans are quite critical of some of our approaches. But in terms of just their psyche and their heart, there is a difference. But it's not necessarily absolutely positive or absolutely negative. Does that sort of answer the question?
The lady 4 rows down here in the green. No, keep going. Yeah, there we are.
Stina.
I've got quite a few questions.
Yeah.
I'll try to stick to a couple. First of all, what would you say to an Afghan living in Helmand who'd say that since the British have come, the situation there has gone from being fairly peaceful to a lot of destruction, a lot of bombing, and a lot of people who have lost family members? And the other question I have is about where you think the Taliban were coming from, and if they were mostly coming from over the border. Wasn't that frustrating for you, that you're fighting there, and yet we are apparently allies of Pakistan who are training, or at least turning a blind eye to the Taliban?
I think you pose a very difficult question when you talk to people who have had their houses destroyed either by our fire or indeed by the Taliban's fire, or you talk to a family who's had a son who's had his head cut off because he's taught at a school by the Taliban. And that's very difficult because they are, they are seeing firsthand the consequences. But at the same time, I think that a lot of people turn around and say, yes, Helmand was really peaceful beforehand, and we came and stirred up a hornet's nest. I think that's one way of looking at it, and you can say there's a grain of truth in that to some extent. But that was because it was a sort of Taliban enclave, and the Taliban ruled with a rod of iron. The Taliban are quite capable of one of the things that they might have done to my soldiers, and they wanted to do, was if they caught one of my soldiers, was to gouge out his eyes, cut his fingers off, and then return him to our district centre. Now, that's what the feed that we were getting was going to happen. So these are the people we're dealing with. That went round, and that is how they ruled their peaceful little Helmand Province before we turned up. So, yes, as soon as you engage in some form of campaign, you're going to, and it sounds really flippant, and I don't mean it to sound flippant, but you have to break eggs to make omelettes. The key thing is you have to minimise the impact on the local population. You're absolutely right, Christina, it's something that's taken very seriously. And there will sometimes be collateral damage. And again, I don't say that lightly at the end of the day. But is the general cause right? Is it better than sitting down and doing nothing? I think partly for the reasons I explained of why we're there in the first place, I think it's right. What we've got to do is make sure that we conduct our operations in a way that win over people's support and don't negate against it. And of course, if a bomb goes astray, which I sometimes will with the best will in the world, that of course counts against us. And absolutely. But interesting enough, the people in Sangin saw that close quarter fighting. They had their lives disrupted by it, but it's now given them an environment where I said, 90% of the intelligence we're getting is from the people talking to us. Now, they're not doing that because they want to drive us out. Would they like to see Afghan soldiers, no British soldiers? Of course they would, but they do see a path. What they've got at the moment is security to go about their daily business, live their lives as they would wish to, with no one round the corner ready to beat the living daylights out of them or cut their head off, which is what the Taliban do. And I'm not trying to demonise them. This is what these people do at the end of the day. Pakistanis coming across the border. Were we frustrated about it? No, we're not, because I know my counterinsurgency history. You have sanctuary areas. People come across borders. That's why you sustain an insurgency. It's part and parcel of the situation we faced. However, what is interesting is, and this is my view, the more Pakistanis that come in and fight, or people of Pakistani origin from the Waziristan area and all the rest, and that's very complex, the better it is for us at the end of the day. The reason why the old Afghan, love him as much as I do, is a very xenophobic fellow. And I could almost guarantee that there were probably lots of local Afghans who hated people from a different country coming across, abusing their women, telling them how to live their lives, carrying out the will of the Taliban, than they did British soldiers in their town, or indeed other Afghan soldiers from Herat in the ANA. And I remember having a conversation with a bunch of elders who were clearly Taliban, or were running with the Taliban, and they were saying, oh, you must stop shooting at us. And I said, well, we'll stop shooting at you when you stop shooting at us. And they said, no, we're not shooting at you, it's the bad Taliban out in the hills and all the rest of it. We're not involved in any of this. About 3 weeks later, we'd begun to see some Pakistanis coming in, and we'd killed several of them, and arrested some or detained some as well. And so I asked them about the Pakistanis, and they all looked a bit perplexed. And I said, is this because you're not up to fighting us anymore? And so you're calling in the Pakistanis? And they said, no, not at all. That attack last week, that was us, sort of thing. And we had a bit of a laugh and a joke about it. But they hate the Pakistanis. The people in Sangin can't stand it. And it's a bit like in the Malayan campaign, most of the communist insurgents were of Chinese origin. It was much easier to win the Malay population over, because actually the people who were trying to push the cause came from a different ethnic region. So in the longer term, I don't think by bringing in foreign fighters actually helps the Taliban at all. I think it makes it, one, easier to identify them, even though some of them are quite good fighters, and secondly, it rubs the xenophobic nature of the Afghan in such a way that is probably conducive to us increasingly winning their support.
Okay.
Thank you. Hello, Col Tootal. We met on an airplane.
Yeah, we did. Nice, yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to start my question by reminding everybody that the head of the British Army recently wanted to see parades that British soldiers, when coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, celebrated on parades. At the same time, having just done an ed-bed myself, it was clear to me that there were real editorial difficulties with showing British casualties. The British Army would like to show the fighting in Afghanistan without any British suffering. And I'm concerned about this because I don't think the two match. If we can't see soldiers suffering when they do, injured soldiers, how are we going to bridge this gap that is perceived between the British Army and the British public taking ownership of its own violence? And perhaps I just might end my question by observing that in this room, the large pictures that were carefully chosen by people, at least 4 of them, and chosen for their excellence in photojournalism, include suffering, and perhaps 5 out of the 7 large ones. And might also extend that to the fact that you've got 2 photographs behind you, one of an atomic bomb, Hiroshima, and one of Nagasaki. And observe that the Nagasaki one just behind you was suppressed by the Americans for 5 years. But that was to prevent us understanding the suffering of the Japanese at the time. But so I really just wanted to get back to the fact that journalism is very powerful when it shows suffering, and yet why does the British Army seem to wish to control it so that it's not shown?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there are two aspects to it. I mean, the first one is, and I don't think he's here, but someone took some footage of one of my chaps who'd taken a piece of fragment through his eye, lost his eye, lodged in the back of his brain, and was fitting on a stretcher. One of my officers, actually. And I'd actually said specifically, I don't want you taking any pictures of casualties. Now, I don't really give a stuff what the MOD thinks about it, but I do care about Jim Berry's mum seeing their son on the 9 o'clock news fitting, naked, because we've cut in a frenzy all his clothes off because we're looking for other splinter wounds to see if we've missed an arterial bleed that's going to kill him. So that's the first bit, and I'm quite clear about that at the end of the day. But if someone wants to come down and photograph one of my chaps who's quite happy to be photographed, who's had an amputation just below his thigh, then I don't have a problem with that, because, you know, that's part and parcel of life. If someone wanted to photograph a wounded soldier because he was lightly wounded, and he can turn around and say, oh, actually, you know, this is quite an alley folk with my hole in my arm and all the rest of it, that's fine. But, you know, your average wounded soldier is a pretty frightened beast. He's just been hit by something with huge kinetic energy, and you know, Vaughan, because you've been a soldier, and all the rest of it. He's probably losing a lot of fluids. He's probably in shock. He's in an unfamiliar place. He's got to be flown back somewhere. He's thinking about his family. He's thinking about losing his mates. He may not be conscious. He may be fitting like Jim Berry was. You can't take his consent to take a photograph, and neither should you. And I feel quite strongly about that. Now, if somehow photographs were... If someone took some photographs and then said to me, look, I've got these photographs. They may show chaps in a Black Hawk helicopter, you know, mourning the losses they've suffered. And I know a little bit about the background to that picture. And were then to present them to all parties involved, commanding officers, more importantly the guy who's hit, and said, hey, listen, 3 months ago, there you were with your leg blown across the road, all the rest of it, pissing blood out of the stump. You know, you probably shat yourself and pissed yourself as well, because that sort of things happen when you're tragically injured. Do you mind if I put that on the front page? That's slightly different. So I don't think it's about, from my view, it's about suppression, because we don't want to show the horrors of war. And if you, and I had a DVD which I was going to play, but it's too long and it's probably not the right forum to show it. But we end with really two bits, and it's some casualties going into the back of the helicopter, all who survived, who all have, we have their consent to show that at the end of the day. But it's pretty emotive when you see two of your blokes being stretchered off, and with Damien Jackson, who was my first private soldier who was killed up in Sangin, coming back home on the back of a C-17. It's pretty powerful. I've seen that image, I don't know, 20, 30 times, and I still get a lump in my throat. I even actually feel quite emotional talking about it now. And I don't know why, maybe because it was my youngest or whatever it was, and he was a bloody good bloke. 4 days short of his 19th birthday. But his family know that, and are happy with that. So it's how you get this consent bit. And so it's all very well saying, okay, let's show that. But, you know, can you imagine, I mean, some of you must have children, suddenly seeing your son or your daughter, because there are lots of women in Afghanistan as well, serving with the British forces there, in some form of distress, agony, limbs missing. You wouldn't. So unless you somehow capture these images and then vet them and filter them in a way where people are content for them to be released, it's very difficult to do, and you would probably see that as suppression. I just see it as actually managing the moral component of my people at the end of the day. Sorry, that's long-winded, but...
We've been hearing contradictory reports about Iran's role in Afghanistan. The Afghan government and the Afghan officials say Iran has a positive role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan. And on the other hand, we hear the American officials saying that Iran is arming the Taliban insurgents. It's a good opportunity to ask you, as a person who's been there on the ground, to see what's your take on that.
Well, I saw no evidence 18 months ago that the Iranians were equipping. Now, I just say that's what I saw. I'm not I'm not well sighted on sort of J2 pictures, so I'm the wrong person to ask. But what I would say is that I genuinely believe that, and of course geopolitics play in all of this, but I generally believe it's not in the Iranian interest, from my perception, to have Afghanistan in the sort of heart and heat of an insurgency, because it can only be destabilising. For example, it puts coalition forces on the other side of their border, when I think they're just like a stable Afghanistan, the Afghans doing the business, which is what we want in the longer term. And likewise, the impact on the drugs trade, on Iran itself. So I don't know what the detailed J2 picture is, the intelligence picture that means, and nor would I really be authorised, as you'd expect, for me to talk about that, but I don't know anyway. But certainly my perception is that Iranian engagement was not evident to me on the ground.
You are aware that Iran did cooperate with the coalition forces, including America, in the first days of their attack on Afghanistan. It's just, for me, it's a bit difficult to. I mean, if you say that Iran is, arming the insurgents in Iraq, I would think twice about that. Maybe it's right, maybe it's not. But as for Afghanistan, the Taliban were threatening Iran, and because Iran is a Shia country and they are hardline Wahhabi Sunnis, they basically hate Iranians. So, and Iran did cooperate with America and the coalition forces. This was not in the news, of course, but they did cooperate, and Iran did play a very important role, cooperating with the coalition forces in actually, in the attack on Afghanistan. For me, it's very difficult to believe that Iran would help its enemy, the Taliban, to fight, the coalition forces, when the coalition forces attack on Afghanistan was a favour for Iran, because it would get, Iran would get rid of the Taliban, and like you mentioned, the drug trafficking, Iran is suffering heavily from that, and of course the rest of the world.
Yeah, I like I say, I'm not really qualified to answer. I mean, I'm really not. I'm actually probably quite ignorant about that particular situation. As I say again, I saw no particular evidence. The only point I would say, and it's a bit like with the Pakistan influence, I mean, the border, the Durrant line, is just not recognised in many Pashtun circles, probably most. So you have this spread across the border. So I don't necessarily see it as a state sponsoring the Taliban. I'm not suggesting that. This is because that's the way it is geopolitically and geographically in that area, that the Waziristanis can come across and support at the end of the day. But I don't think you would, certainly from my limited knowledge, experience what you're seeing from Waziristan coming up into Helmand and through the likes of Spin Boldak and Kandahar, being mirrored necessarily on the Iranian border. But that's a layman's view, I mean, not an expert's view.
You've already talked very well about lots of the paradoxes involved in Afghanistan. I'd just like to ask your comments on a couple of others. One is the paradox between the counterinsurgency agenda and the counter-narcotics agenda.
I knew somebody
which
asked
some
me
people
about
would
that, yeah.
say as, to some extent, contradictory, etc. So you can anticipate my question there. The second one, perhaps less obviously, probably not, just as obvious, is the paradox between troops being good and troops doing good. And you've talked a lot about how well the British troops have served there, and I've also been privileged to command British troops, so I know exactly how good they are, and I think they're the best in the world. If they're given the wrong orders, though, or if somehow the strategic mission was done wrongly because somebody back in London stuffed up, at the end of the day, they might get the wrong end of that message. How do we better manage troops being good versus troops doing good? We know that sometimes what they do doesn't necessarily further the cause, and yet we don't want to endanger them, and we certainly don't want to endanger their reputation as being really good troops. How does one get around that?
I mean, you're talking about abuse, aren't you? Well, I don't think, if you say troops being good, to my view, we'll be able to operate across the spectrum of conflict. So at the one end, we're doing humanitarian effort, and it might be bringing in relief supplies. On the other end, we're stuffing bayonets into people's faces because they are the enemy and they're trying to kill us within legitimate rules of engagement. And then we've got to move across what Marine General Krulak called this three-block war. And what he was saying, within one block, you had all the dimensions of war, from humanitarian to sort of hard-end war fighting. They've got to be good at all of that at the end of the day. and my soldiers could be very good at fighting through a position, and they would kill Taliban when they came across them, because they were threatening them, etc., etc. But I also saw an ability to suddenly call off fire. And I remember once we were moving into a compound, and we were taking quite a lot of fire from this particular compound. And it was effective. It was about to start causing casualties. And quite rightly, we called in some air power to drop a aerial-delivered munition on the compound to reduce and minimise the threat, to eradicate it. And it was actually one of my young corporals, you know, tattooed 3-para badge on his arm, airborne on his back, not quite love and hate on his knuckles, but you know, this was a red, meat-eating paratrooper in all sense of the word, and a guy you definitely wanted to go in front of you. He called the fire off because he thought he saw civilians in the compound. So even though he was most exposed with bullets whacking around him, he called the fire off because it was.
And that's what they do best. Sorry, but if at the same time those blokes are then asked to go and paint a dozen schools because somebody thinks that's a good PR message for the headlines back home, but actually that's probably the worst thing they could possibly do, because those dozen schools will be blown up next week because of the perception of somebody that they're now implicated in the coalition efforts, etc., or whatever. Is that doing the right thing? Excellent troops, but are they being deployed in the right way?
Well, I think they need to be able to go if it's right, and it's not always appropriate to paint a school for whatever reason. I know the whole debate about dependency and crossing certain boundaries and all that sort of stuff. But then, for example, you know, people delivered babies and that sort of thing, and you'll get a soldier who, you know, one moment is, you know, doing the killing, the stabbing and the fragging, and the next minute maybe delivering a baby and has no problem doing either. I mean, soldiers are quite compassionate people because they see suffering. They may be hardened to it in some circumstances, but there is a very compassionate side of sort of doing good to people. I mean, my greatest regret in leaving Afghanistan, of course, losing soldiers, but loss and risk is the business we're in, and I'm not being flippant about it by any means at all, was I didn't go and fix a washing machine for a hospital when I could have done, but I wasn't allowed to. You know, that's all changed.
That's quite a famous story, actually.
Yeah, and that wouldn't happen now. Coming back to your question, that wouldn't happen now, because actually the whole government bit's matured. But that was my regret at the end of the day. Now, other people have different opinions about it, and that's absolutely fine. But what you can't tolerate in an armed force is abuse. So I said to my soldiers, listen, you may find yourself where you apply violence, and then in retrospect and hindsight, it was inappropriate. But at the time you felt threatened of what you were seeing, complex situation, people shooting at you, etc., etc., you pulled your trigger. If it's an honest mistake, and I mean an honest mistake, then I would support my soldiers to the hilt, and I went on record publicly that I would do that. However, if one of my soldiers abused someone, beat up a prisoner, mishandled a woman, applied violence when absolutely not necessary and it is gratuitous rather than justified, then I would have him court-martialed. And every single one of my soldiers knew that at the end of the day. And we pushed that through training. So when there's the red mist was up, it was the old, in that zone of mist you would be right to react in this way. Now, no, it wouldn't be right, because you have a chance to calm down, see what's happening, the threat has gone, the perception of the threat has gone, and we put people under pressure. And they're pretty good at it at the end of the day.
I know. I can't let you get away without answering the first question, though.
Sorry, you better remind me what it was, actually.
Counterinsurgency versus counter-narcotics.
Oh, yeah, drugs, yeah, sorry. I was laying as much smoke as I could, but I didn't manage to wriggle away from it. Well, I'll give you my view. Production of the opium crop is the staple of the vast majority of people in Helmand. Whether you like it or not, whether it wasn't 10 years ago, it is now. You can't remove that and not replace it with something that provides the same degree of remuneration. So, you know, if anyone ever says to me again, oh, we get them to grow wheat, they grow stacks of wheat. In fact, they're so clever now, they often grow wheat amongst the poppy crops, so if you destroy it, you're destroying the staple crop, etc., etc. The thing is that if you know anything about farming or bother to do your research, is that wheat is a more intensive product. So actually it's more expensive to grow wheat, and at the same time the yield is not as great as opium. Therefore, you turn around to an Afghan farmer and say, right, you've got to grow wheat. He says, okay, I'll grow wheat, you have to pay me for it more than you'd pay for the poppy, because I need to have fuel for the generators to pump the water up, whereas you can flood the fields once in the right end of the spring season and you don't need to do it again to the poppy, I think. So my view is, however you deal with the problem, there must be an alternative livelihood which pays the same as poppy, at least initially. So one has to draw their own conclusions about that. If you walked into a field and say, I'm about to eradicate all your poppies, but at the same time, here's the cash value of the crop that you would receive, I'll say, great, I don't have to harvest it and I'm still making my money. That's not a problem. So my stance on, and I think we do need to resolve the problem, not just because 90% of the heroin on the streets comes from places like Afghanistan here, but it also helps fuel some of the insurgency. But you can't deal with it just by eradication. Now, some people may disagree with me, but they have probably not commanded troops in the Sangin Valley, where you have to have a certain amount of separation, unless you've got the alternative. Does that answer the question? You know, and that probably isn't policy compliant, but that's my view, and it's my honest view.
Lady down here in the second row.
You said that Afghanistan was the front line of terrorism, and that was the reason why the British Army and the coalition forces were there. Given that the Taliban are not international jihadists, and that during the first round, actually Al-Qaeda did withdraw and seems to be now settling along the Pakistan border, I can't quite see how that can square.
But do you not think that if the Taliban came back, ignoring the humanitarian side, these are people who cut people's fingers off and gouge out their eyes, do you not think that they would not become a haven for Al-Qaeda to move back in and benefit from all the infrastructure that they gave Osama bin Laden at the time, who could move around with more or less impunity unless a large force came in like Operation Enduring Freedom did in 2002? I think that would absolutely happen. I mean, I think the threat to this country is significant. You only have to go to an airport and see what, you know, you're having to do. I mean, flying back from the States, I mean, it took me 3 hours to get through Miami International through the security. And that is because there's a real threat out there. It's a very serious one at the end of the day.
I don't know, my impression is that actually Afghanistan is being used, abused, whatever, as the front line to fight, because you can't get into Pakistan.
Well, I completely disagree with that in terms of we wouldn't go into Pakistan because Pakistan's not a failed state. I mean, it's got problems, well, of course it's got problems, but the fact is there is some form of containment. Whether you think it's good, successful, right, doesn't matter. You're not asking me about that. But Afghanistan, you know, it's a vacuum. It's a lawless, it was a lawless place, and it's still got lots of areas which are lawless. I am very, very much of the view that you can't have places like that around the world. I mean, there's a humanitarian argument, but ignore that for the moment. And a lot of humanitarian good is being done in Afghanistan, but it's dangerous. It's seriously dangerous.
I'm going to take 2 more questions. This lady here in this second row.
Just following on from what you were saying about matching poppies with cash, cutting off the supply of those who are supplying the Taliban, so whether they're coming from Pakistan or anywhere else, is there the Hearts and Minds campaign, is part of that directed at trying to win over kids before they get to the Taliban, offering rehabilitation packages or job offers, training, bearing in mind it's the biggest employer in certain areas?
Well, the whole sort of children's bit, I think is absolutely right. We wanted to target the schools. I go in with Afghan soldiers and say, hey, this is what we're about. Let's go and play football. Let's give you some notebooks and all the rest of it. And get the kids to ask us questions. You know, are you here to kill, you know, my father? Are you here to stamp on our religion? We could talk through all that. You know, I've got some Muslim soldiers that I could have brought down who are Pakistanis. And the reason I wanted to target the schools more than we did was because I thought, 1, they're the future, 2, they're impressionable. Now, that might sound a bit like propaganda, but there is a realism here. Secondly, they can access the women, which we couldn't do. I wouldn't look at a woman. I mean, whether she had a burqa or not, and I would not engage in with a woman whatsoever, and all my soldiers were briefed not to, because it causes offence in places like Helmand Province. So we don't do it out of deference to culture. So we could never access the women. But despite the nature of Afghan society, there are probably a lot of female women behind the throne in the household, absolutely guaranteed. And it's we, equivalent, I was going to say, we Jimmy, who goes home and says, oh, these British soldiers turned up and I thought they were right round the dinner table. We'll be turning around and say, but they came farther, and I disagree that they said that, because then there was a Muslim guy as well. They inform the debate. And so absolutely, I think we need to target the children. I'm saying we, not just the coalition, but the Afghans as a whole, to change perceptions, to try and sow the germ of just a different intellectual concept about the future and how you do business. And it's not all about the wheel of fortune turning of whether it's Soviets, Afghans fighting themselves, or the Taliban. And I think it's right to rehabilitate. Undoubtedly, the Taliban will be part of the political solution, and the resolution can only be but political at the end of the day. But it's what type of Taliban, on what terms, and also who are the Taliban? I mean, they vary. Yes, there are hardcore fighters. Yes, there are people who are influenced by AQ. Yes, there are probably also people who passionately believe in what they're doing because they've been indoctrinated or they've only seen one thing. But a little bit like in the Dhofar campaign, hard-nosed Adu were turned, and the SEP program, surrendered enemy personnel, who then became the most vicious fighters for Sultan Qaboos, because they saw a different lifestyle. If you live up on the hill and everyone just says, or you come from a madrasa where you have spent 12 to 14 hours a day learning by rote the Quran, and you've been told one thing from an impressionable age, you then suddenly get a trip in the hills and you see the propaganda and you hear the stories, you're probably treated quite badly by the Taliban. You're probably buggered senseless by them, because that's what they do. And then you suddenly come across the Brits. And we captured a guy who'd been shot through the legs in a little battle we had in a place called Nowzad. And this guy was doped up to the eyeballs. I mean, didn't murmur. I mean, the Afghans are tough, but this guy, had some nasty leg wounds and complicated fractures in his legs. So we picked him up, we bandaged him up, we gave him some morphine. I don't think it made a blind bit of difference to him anyway. And we casevaced him, first man out, because he was the most badly wounded. I had a couple of soldiers who had some shrapnel injuries, but we brought in a chopper to move him out, because this guy was going to suffer if we got him back to the field hospital, and he's treated before anyone else, because that's what we do. It's decency. It's also a law. The Geneva Convention determines we do that, quite rightly so. Now, I don't really know exactly what happened to that chap, but I do know someone said to me, we got involved with him, we treated him, obviously he was dealt with by certain people of interest in him for intelligence reasons, and he said, the best I've ever been treated by in my life was by the British. And he talked about being up in the hills, buggered by the Taliban, beaten up by them, etc. And now I'm not sure what that guy's doing now, but I suspect that if he has a choice, his choice is not to run with the Taliban anymore. So I think rehabilitation, reconciliation's absolutely key.
I wish you'd told me that story when I was researching the book, Stuart, but better late than never. Last question, that lady over in the corner at the back.
Thank you. You mentioned the fact that the Taliban tactics are going from conventional to asymmetric. Anyone who's watched Basra for the last 4 years has seen how such cruel and random terrorist tactics have not only sapped civilian support, but also troop morale. Is there a danger that Afghanistan goes that way?
I don't think so. I mean, I think I mentioned I'm not a subject matter on Iraq. I've served there a couple of times, but it's quite a long time ago now, and I'm 4 years out of date from the invasion in 2003 when I was last there. People are concerned about suicide bombers. Understandably so. It's a very, very difficult thing to defeat. If someone's prepared to run and hug you with a jacket of explosives and blow you and whoever else up, there are ways of defeating it. My concern about the suicide bomber is that you try to then separate yourself from the people, which is exactly what you mustn't do. So my view is we took risk. and I accepted that I might lose some of my people to suicide bombers, but the longer-term goal was to integrate with the people as much as possible. Does that trouble soldiers? Yes, it does. People don't like being blown up by roadside bombs or suicide bombers because it's not cricket, it's not fair. But can they be countered, and do you have to work your confidences in your training? And a lot of the threat, particularly of roadside bombs, which you wouldn't expect me to go into, can be dealt with by professionalism, proper planning, thinking things through, doing what we call TTPs, tactics, techniques and procedures, thinking the threat. And people cope with it. Yeah, it's not great when you lose soldiers who are blown up, and it certainly happened to us once, and we lost 3 dead and 1 very badly wounded chap. And it's awful. But at the end of the day, it is unfortunately part of the business we're in. It's part of the arsenal of weaponry which is used against us. And it's interesting how people will understandably focus on Allied air power and how sometimes it might go astray and will cause collateral damage to civilians. They don't seem to be quite so concerned about these nasty devices that go off, and I've climbed into the back of an armoured vehicle to recover one of my soldiers and what was left of him after it had been hit by 2 anti-tank mines and a huge amount of explosive as well. But no one seems to be quite so concerned about roadside bombs. Yes, it's a nasty part of war. I mean, I'm not dismissing that collateral damage is pretty reprehensible and horrible as well, but so's being blown up by an IED. But it's part of what we do, and we have to deal with it and accept that will casualties increase from those sort of weapon systems? Undoubtedly, yes. But as more weapon systems are used, better techniques of countering them, there's better protective equipment, new heavy armoured vehicles like Mastiff, which are bloody good and are making a difference and are saving lives. But it's a risky old business, and it will always be there, and our soldiers are brilliant at swinging with it and signing up to it. Because it's what we do, as RSM Hardy said.
One last thing, Stuart. As of December, you'll no longer be CEO of 3 Para. How do you feel about the parting of the ways?
Yeah, I mean, desperate. I mean, 3 Para has been the best 2 years of my life, without a shadow of a doubt, and it has been my life and soul for 2 years. And they are a fantastic bunch of people, and any success we had there, is all about my soldiers. And it's going to be hard. You know, I have done, and I'm sure many people who've commanded soldiers, to do it as a commanding officer is a real privilege. I have done the best job that you can possibly do in the army. How I'm going to rival that, I don't know. It's going to be difficult, and leaving them is going to be very hard, but it does come to an end. Nothing lasts forever, very, very sadly.
Well, thank you very much for that. I've learnt a lot tonight. Thank you very much for your expertise and your insights, and I have to say your honesty. It was very, very refreshing and very illuminating. Ladies and gentlemen, Stuart Tootal.